So good morning. I'm really deeply honored to be here today speaking to you. I'm also very excited to talk about mobility and accessibility for two main reasons. One of the reasons is the fact that these are problems which have an increasingly important social impact. And the second reason is that many of these problems are raising fundamental scientific and technological challenges that this community is ideally positioned to address. So why is mobility a challenge? And there are basically three reasons. The first one is what is called the first and the last mile issue. So if you build a transit system and you make people walk about 3/4 of a mile, essentially you lose 90% of your ridership, except in the city of Calgary, as you can see on this particular slide for some reason. So this is essentially 3/4 of a mile and you lose 90% of your ridership. So if you want to be successful, you have to pick up people very close to where they live and drop them very, very close to where they want to go. And when I say very close, it's less than 50 meters, 50 yards. The second problem that probably many of you are aware is congestion. We are spending hundreds of billions of dollars in congestion everywhere, in the US, in Europe, in many countries around the world. And this is a problem which is increasingly severe as more populations are moving inside the cities. Because of this massive amount of cars on the road, transportation is now about 30% of the accounts for about 30% of the greenhouse gas emission. And out of these 30%, 60% is coming from small cars and small trucks. There are even cities in Europe, like this one, which is actually very nice, where people are even considering giving free public transit to everyone, such that you decrease pollution inside the city. So that also gives you the magnitude of some of these problems. So far I've been essentially trying to depress you. The next thing is actually talking about opportunities. And there are tremendous opportunities. And the next slide is actually interesting because I'm going to tell you what I think is the most important thing, what can change mobility, what has been changing mobility in the last 10 years. And this is this. So I think this is the most important thing. This is what is actually changing mobility. Is connectivity, the fact that we can connect people to infrastructure, to systems, to cars, and to infrastructure, as I said. This is what is making the next generation of transportation system possible. At some point, autonomous cars are going to come, and in one shape or another, in various deployment ways. They are not necessary for some of the systems that I've shown you, but they can be integrated nicely, and I will show you what the benefits can be. But mostly it's going to be a cost benefit. That's the second key enabler for mobility. The third one is essentially what this community is doing. Is analytics, and the slides that you see there is, I borrowed it from one of my friends at IBM. And what it's basically telling you is all the levels of analytics that you need for actually designing a new mobility system. So it starts from understanding what the system does, understanding what it does well, what it doesn't do so well, and then trying to predict what the system will do in the future, and then moving to prescriptive analytics, which is optimization mechanism design. So one of the things that people don't, when they think about ride sharing, they think about pictures like this. So people hate ride sharing. But one of the things that I want to tell you is that this is not reality, right? So the next plot is going to be very interesting. This is ride sharing, the system that I've shown you. So most of the time, people are riding alone in these cars. So the average number of people in the car, if you have 2,000 vehicles, is 1.3. It's only if you have 1,500 vehicles that it increased to 1.5. So essentially, most of the time you don't ride share. It's only during peak times and when you really have a spike in demand in some particular areas that this happens. This is also the number of idle vehicles inside the system that we have there. It's essentially the vehicles are utilized about 80 to 90% of the time, which is kind of remarkable. It's very different from the utilization of Uber and Lyft, for instance. So let me tell you what we have to do behind the scenes. So we do real-time optimization to do this. We optimize every 30 seconds. We accumulate requests, and then we optimize them as best as we can. How do we optimize? So this is the master optimization problem. We minimize waiting time. We make sure that every one of the riders is covered, and then that every route that every vehicle is only traveling one route. So you can imagine that this is a column generation and branch and price algorithm. One of the things that we have, which is a very nice innovation there, is that we penalize riders which are not served during this particular epoch, this particular optimization. And we make sure that we minimize the number of people who are not covered that way. And that's how we maintain a very nice worst case waiting time. Now, this is the pricing problem. You can probably not see it, and this is, this is much better that way, because this is the nightmare in this particular problem. This is a slide to. So there was a very nice presentation yesterday by Song on something very similar to this. And so this is the issue when you are minimizing waiting time. It's very difficult to do pricing because the typical techniques that you want to do is this resource constraint shortest path. But you only know waiting time when you have to plan all the routes, but you would like to do that in a dynamic fashion, but this is very difficult to do. You could use time-expanded graph, but then the size of this system is so large that you would basically blow up the computational results. So what we do is that we have a very dedicated algorithm to do this pricing using constraint programming and various kinds of pruning techniques that are using the structure of the problem. And we basically generate as many disjoint routes as possible. So it's a very interesting challenge that this new mobility system have when you try not to minimize the travel cost but minimize convenience or accessibility. You get different objective functions and they are very challenging from a computational standpoint.
Hi, I'm Keith Albertson of IISE. We're here at the Annual Conference Expo in Orlando, Florida. And I'm speaking with Professor Pascal Van Hentenryck from Georgia Tech, who is our keynote speaker this morning on the second day of the conference. It's from Georgia Tech in Atlanta, which is my hometown. And appropriately, his talk this morning was on mobility and transportation and traffic issues, which those of us from Atlanta know are a big issue all the time.
I'm getting worse.
Yeah. And Professor, being from Atlanta, both of us, the first thing I want to ask you is, how long is your commute every day?
So my commute is about 30 minutes off peak essentially, because I don't drive during the peak time. Okay. So it's already long enough. My commute used to be 5 minutes, so it's a big change.
So you have personal experience in the difficulty of mobility.
Oh, yes. What I did in the first couple of weeks I lived in Atlanta was actually trying the best way to get from my home to Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because you can go a little bit faster, but then the probability of an accident is very high, and then you can spend much longer. So I basically optimize, and I don't use the highways, I use the small roads.
Yeah.
So it's basically you minimize expected time, not really the shortest time possible of a particular day, because I think an accident would change everything.
Right. Well, that's applying problem-solving principles to your
Exactly.
daily traffic.
Yeah. My wife thinks I'm crazy because I do that all the time for everything. I optimize everything.
Yeah. You mentioned in your talk this morning, I think a lot of people realize that traffic is a horrible inconvenience.
Yeah.
And if you're sitting in traffic, you're annoyed. But for many people, it's more than that. When you're talking about issues in mobility, when it comes to getting health care, when it comes to getting groceries, getting students to school. Talk a little bit more about how that's a bigger issue for a lot of people.
I think that's exactly the problem that we are trying to address. It's what we call accessibility to jobs, accessibility to healthcare, to high quality food, and to schools for the children. And I think this is getting worse and worse every year. The accessibility to jobs is becoming a very fundamental issue. There are jobs that people cannot get to, although they could go. They match well with the jobs, and they cannot go because of these mobility issues. And healthcare is the same thing. I mean, it takes time to get to the right hospital, and people, outside during working hours may not be able to do it. They may not have 2 cars to be able to do it.
Right.
Therefore, they skip on these appointments with the health consequence that this entails. Yeah, I think the accessibility problems are getting worse.
One of the things that has changed is the connectivity everyone has with your phone and your GPS, and how that has really changed.
I see you listen to the talk very well. Yeah, I think for me it's very surprising. So when I give some of these talks, I always put this picture of the iPhone or Android phone. And people are very surprised. They don't think about impact that connectivity has done. But essentially, we have a very rich set of data now. We can communicate to people, we can communicate to the infrastructure. And for me, that's the key enabler. That without that, nothing else can be done. And so this is really what, for me, is a step change in the ability that we have as system engineers to actually change mobility. Yes,
and with that, the changing expectations, because we have a new generation now that's not necessarily single car. They're more expectant of public transportation, mass transit. So how are we adjusting to be able to meet their expectations?
So I think they complain to me a lot. So because of my job, because of my kids, I have a lot of interactions with young people, and they basically don't understand why transit is better organized, why there are not more mobility options that remove some of the cars off the road. So they basically come to the world with less preconceptions that we have. I grew up wanting a car as soon as I could. Right. And I think it's very different. It's very different. And so they have different expectations. And they basically complain that this is not done. But at the same time, they do something about it. I mean, they use public transit, even if it's inconvenient. They use, Zipcar and other, car sharing system, because they basically believe that if everybody does it, then you get a much better mobility system for everyone, less congestion and more convenience. Mm-hmm. So they are taking steps, but I think what we need is, system thinking at the level of the cities, at the level of the states.
Your work in your research and working on the optimization of mobility is, and we saw in your presentation this morning how complicated it is, because every place is so different, and the unique aspects of travel. You compare different cities and sort of the different mobility issues they all have. So you really have to design something unique for every place you go.
Yeah. So I think the interesting point is that I made the comparison with the airline industry and saying that in the airline you can consolidate by cities and by airport and so on. This is not the case in mobility. Two people in different neighborhoods will have very different expectations of what the transit system can do, because they may need it in different fashion. Mm-hmm. And so when you design these systems, they become massively complicated, because you have to deal with this massive scale of people for a city. And I think that's one of the challenges that we are facing. But I think we are in a good situation, because optimization technology, analytics in general, has made so much progress in the last decade that we can start addressing this system in a much more holistic fashion. Mm-hmm. So I think from an engineer standpoint, I think these are really interesting challenges, and we love working on challenges, as you know. And I think that they are ready to be applied to this very large city. I mean, I'm not saying that we are there yet, but very, very close.
Well, and the other challenge that you may have when you're designing something, any sort of program or optimization for an industry or business, you got a one-size-fits-all. You're having to deal with governments. And when you're dealing with transportation, and in a situation like Atlanta, you're dealing with multiple governments.
Yes.
How complicated is that, to trying to get everybody on board with budgets and everything else to accept whatever plans might be helpful?
Yes, I think you're entirely right. I think the transit agencies have multiple stakeholders. They have to work with different people. It's not very easy for them. At the same time, you see, for instance, in Atlanta, MARTA is making very substantial investments in transit, because they know that the situation is not sustainable. And what I have found is that they are extremely open. So we had, our main point of contact at MARTA coming to see some of the presentation we were doing. He was taking note. He was saying, "Hey, this is really cool. We need this." Mm-hmm. I think they are really eager to start applying some of these things. I'm not, I don't mean that this is easy. But I think there is a will that you see, coming out more and more into applying some of these new ideas, because they know that the system right now is not sustainable the way it is.
Yeah, and I think everybody would agree who has to sit in traffic and deal with mobility issues. Yeah. Well, Professor, thank you so much.
No,
it was
thank
a
you
wonderful
very much
talk today, and it's certainly an issue everyone can relate to. So,
yeah, I know.
And everyone's happy that IEs are applying their knowledge to try and fix this problem that everyone has.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much.
Nice
Great
talking
to have you with us.